There's a building in Manhattan like no other in the world, where Mark Twain slept, Madonna posed, and Jimi Hendrix roamed.
Welcome to the Hotel Chelsea.
Please wake up. Talk. Because what you're saying is totally unintelligible and he can't understand you. And we called him, so that means it's a waste of his time. So let's give him a good interview, right?
What do you know what I mean?
Do I know what you mean? About why you called it a day? Yeah, I know what you mean.
A year ago, the punks made their own rules. Now that punk and the music industry have come together, the rules have changed.
Punk rockers. The new craze, they tell me. Not the nice, clean Rolling Stones. They're a group called the Sex Pistols. You see, they're as drunk as I am. They're clean by comparison. Just let us see the Sex Pistols in action.
It appears that way when you look back on it now, just, you know, how manipulated we were by record companies and particularly the press. But at the same time, we just went along with it because it was amusing to us.
According to McLaren, we decided we needed mannequins to model our clothes, and that was when we invented the Sex Pistols, with Johnny doing his audition there in the shop. And he said, "I thought the fashion was much more important than the music. Punk was the sound of that fashion." So instead of industry plans controlled by a label, the Sex Pistols were controlled by a clothing boutique in London.
And, I got hold of these young kids who were really fans of all the characters that were coming into my shop, and they sort of adopted me as somebody who knew all these guys and could give them the path to nirvana and pop stardom, as it were. And I decided to go along with it and called them the Sex Pistols.
They stuck a safety pin through Her Majesty's nose and turned the national press into an occupied zone. They smuggled a great train robber into the top 10 and destroyed the myths of their own success. They held the record business to ransom and swindled £1 million in the process.
The greatest technique involved in managing the Sex Pistols was always to create the right explosion and then know that it was going to happen, and as a manager, run into the toilet and come out after the explosion and say, "God, what's happened?"
Yeah, well, a lot of the ideas he never told us, you know. He just used to shove us out there, and we just get on and do our thing, play, and he never told us half the things he was scamming, you know what I mean? So he's a complete con man, really.
At the height of his brief career, he was one of the kings of punk. In America, punk rock died sometime before him.
Was the progenitor of punk. He and the Sex Pistols made international headlines for their antisocial antics that often triggered violence in the audience. They beat each other, they vomited on stage. And because of their criminal records off stage, Vicious once knocked a British Bobby's teeth out, the U.S. State Department for a while refused to give them visas for their American tour. It relented, and the tour lasted 6 months. The night the group split up, Vicious was pulled off a plane at Kennedy Airport, the victim of a drug overdose. Since then, he's lived at the Chelsea Hotel, performing infrequently.
Despite all the hassles, what was it that you thought the pistol were trying to do? Was it just like really kick the establishment out the arse? Sid?
Sid, damn you! Fuck.
Yeah. What was the next question? What was that question again?
Don't drop it on me again.
Oh, hiya, Sobers. The year was 1971. I'm just kidding, I can't do that for this whole episode, but I thought about it. But in 1971, Malcolm McLaren and Vivienne Westwood, who you might know is like a really prominent figure in the UK fashion world, but they purchased a boutique at 430 Kings Road, and they called it Let It Rock. This would be an epicenter for this huge punk rock explosion that was about to happen. Initially, this boutique carried mostly what is known as teddy boy style clothes, and I had no idea what a teddy boy was, so a little fun fact for you guys. Teddy boy, at least for my American audience, is kind of what we consider to be the greaser phenomenon, this like rock and roll look with the greased up hair, the long leather jackets, kind of the same concept, but this happened over in the UK. So that is what a teddy boy is. But right from the beginning, Let It Rock was trying to stand out, be different, break the mold, and they were trying to bring back this old rock and roll look. Because we're now in 1971, this was really a 50s look that they were trying to bring back. In 1972, they changed the name of the shop to Too Fast to Live, Too Young to Die. And they focused a little bit more on 1960s biker rock style clothes. And of course, Malcolm and Vivienne were making their own clothing. Vivienne would do just these wild things. She would tear clothes. She would, I don't know, just cut them in weird places and turn these like messed up clothing items that she would get from other places that might have something that's a little wonky, like the sleeve is off or like the collar's not right. And she would turn that into a completely new artistic like outfit or piece of clothing. And honestly, that's kind of how she got her start in the fashion world, was being like this queen of punk rock fashion. This 60s biker rock vibe was a lot of studs, a lot of leather, and ultimately led them into this path where they started carrying a lot of very BDSM and bondage style leather gear. So this was just a store where you could go find graphic t-shirts, really strange articles of clothing, lots of leather, lots of bondage stuff, just a very interesting shop. And this would essentially be the epicenter of this blossoming punk movement, because a store like that attracts a lot of the unique individuals that live in that area. In 1974, they decided to rebrand the shop again, and with the style of clothes, the style of boutique that this was, very in your face, very towing the line, maybe even crossing the line, they needed a name that would represent what they stood for. And also, they were selling a lot of BDSM stuff, so it kind of makes sense, but they changed the name of the store to Sex. Great name. Who doesn't love sex? Now, when Malcolm and Vivienne first started the shop, they were at a trade show actually over in the States, in New York. And while they were there, they got to see a New York Dolls show. This was in 1971. And they loved the energy, they loved the vibe, they loved the crowd, they just loved what was going on there. That kind of energy really excited them to want to bring that kind of style of music over to the UK as well.
I actually never got involved in music at all until one final group came in who were very theatrical looking, called the New York Dolls. And they started to buy all this teddy boy clothing that I was selling at the time. And I liked them because they were funny. And when I went to New York to hear them play, well, actually originally to put on a fashion show, which they came to, and we ended up sort of participating in all this drug taking and stuff, and they played for me this tape of theirs. I thought it was the worst record I'd ever heard, but they were so funny it didn't matter, and I realised it didn't matter that the music was bad. What mattered more was the fact that they were so good at being bad, and that gave me a whole other attitude towards music that I didn't have, and it locked in my own thoughts about what was important. And that was the presentation of it all and the attitude behind it, that you didn't have to be good. And that really started me thinking a lot. And I managed the New York Dolls for a while in New York when I went back a few years later.
In 1975, Malcolm found himself back in New York, and he bumped into Sylvan from the New York Dolls. And apparently the band was on the verge of breaking up. In order to help, because Malcolm just truly loved their music and really wanted to promote these guys, he said, I'll go ahead and manage you guys. I'll take on the role. I'll help manage the band, get you guys some gigs. He even gave them the idea for the Red Patent Leather show, where they played wearing all red, and they had a giant Soviet flag behind them. So, I mean, you can tell already he's extremely provocative, and he very much encourages them to toe the line and maybe even cross the line a little bit. I mean, think about how wild that is in the 1970s to blast the Soviet flag anywhere, let alone at a concert like that. They had to be very unpopular for that. Unfortunately, not very long after this, the New York Dolls would disband anyways. This could be a precursor or maybe foreshadowing of the ability of Malcolm to successfully manage a band. So I don't know, maybe bands in the future should be a little bit weary. I don't know, just saying. But heavily inspired by this punk rock scene in New York, he heads back with this newfound experience of managing a punk band and decides that the best way to start pushing these provocative values, this rebellious style that they're trying to promote within their boutique, really push their message out to the masses, is to get a band to essentially represent the shop, wearing these clothes, pushing their messages, stirring up the pot a little bit, just like he did with the New York Dolls and the whole Soviet flag, red leather thing. Now, Sex was a very popular spot in London, especially for younger kids, kind of the outcasts of society. This was a great little melting pot meeting place for everybody with these same values. And in order to formulate this band, it's not really that hard. There's tons of musicians and tons of people who are looking for a chance rolling in and out of this shop. Two such young men were Steve Jones and Paul Cook. Steve played guitar, Paul played drums. They'd been jamming together since 1972. The two of them are pretty good friends. And they were super on board to start this band, start pushing this new punk rock style, and really bring traffic into the boutique. But you can't have a band with just a guitarist and a drummer. It's not a band. Or I guess maybe it is if you're the White Stripes. But anyways, they needed a singer. Well, just outside of the sex shop, they see a kid walking by with an I Hate Pink Floyd shirt on. Now, wearing an I Hate Pink Floyd shirt in London in the 70s, who is this guy? Who hates Pink Floyd? Well, this guy was Johnny Rotten. And supposedly he got his nickname from the rest of the band because his teeth were just so awfully rotten that they just named him Johnny Rotten. Now, they've got mostly a full band, but they were looking for a bassist. And it just so happens that Glenn Matlock, who was an employee at the shop Sex, was totally down to join the band. And not only that, he was a really good bassist. Initially, they called themselves the Strand, then they called themselves the Swankas, and then right before their very first show in 1975, they decided to change their name to the Sex Pistols. Why the Sex Pistols? Well, because they were really representing this shop called Sex, this boutique, and Malcolm McLaren says that Pistols is more referring to like a pinup or like a really young thing or like a really well sharp-dressed person. I don't know. Pistol can also mean extremely crazy and rambunctious person, especially referring to a child. So it kind of fits both aspects, especially knowing what we know about the punk scene. They had their very first gig on November 6th, 1975 at the St. Martin's School of Art. At the show, they were all wearing Vivienne Westwood's new designs and articles of clothing, pushing this fashion while simultaneously lifting up this whole punk rock movement.
Well, that was another scam with all the clothes, because like we had to buy the clothes from his shop, and we'd be on the stage and all the kids would see it, and they'd buy all the clothes, and so we was buying them as well, where, you know, we should have gone for nothing, you know what I mean?
But in essence, these guys are just walking mannequins for this boutique. In November of 1976, they debut their first hit single, Anarchy in the UK, which naturally gets banned on pretty much every single radio station, which only fuels and accelerates the intrigue of this band. People are like, what? I want to know about this band that's getting banned on the radio. Then a month later, in December of 1976, the band appears on the Bill Grundy Show, which is like a little talk show. They were just getting interviewed. And during that interview, Johnny Rotten actually lets the word shit slip out. And that's not something you can do on TV in the 70s. So it was hugely outrageous. And they just represented themselves exactly like you'd think they would, like little punks.
Beethoven, Mozart, Bach, and Brahms. What are you saying, sir?
Wonderful people.
Are they?
Oh, yes, they really turn us on.
Well, suppose they turn other people on.
That's just their tough flick.
It's what?
Nothing, a rude word. Next question.
No. What was the rude word?
Shit.
Was it really? Good heavens. Well, that's it for tonight. I'll be seeing you soon. I hope I'm not seeing you again. From me, though, good night.
Bill Grundy was not a fan, and neither were many of the viewers, and it got them banned in most of the venues from pretty much anywhere nearby, anywhere in London. Teens everywhere were so stoked. They immediately rushed to this boutique Sex to buy this look, to look like these guys, to look like the Sex Pistols. So clearly Malcolm McLaren's idea to dress these guys up in all their boutique clothes to try and market and advertise this way was genius because it seems to be working. Fast forward to February of 1977, and Glenn Matlock is having serious issues with the rest of the band. He's more into the Beatles, he's more into the classic style of rock and roll, not this aggressive, not so musically talented punk rock scene that he seems to be involved with now. And because of that, he has just creative differences with Johnny Rotten as well as Malcolm McLaren. So inevitably, they kind of slowly push him out of the band, and Glenn Matlock eventually leaves the band, but they have to find a new bassist. There had to be tons of kids that were willing to do literally anything to be the new bassist for the Sex Pistols. But that's not what the band wanted. The band needed somebody that was going to boost up their image, that was going to add to the chaos, that was going to highlight just how crazy this new punk scene was and fuel this massive fire. Who better than someone who's already hanging out at this sex shop, who's already going to all the Sex Pistols shows, who's already getting into fights in the audience, who's been arrested for throwing a bottle, breaking and blinding this girl in the crowd. Who better than a guy who gets into fights with people who write negative articles about the Sex Pistols? Who better than a guy who represents this punk rock look better than anybody else? Who better than John Simon Ritchie, aka Sid Vicious?
Let's go.
All right. Welcome back to Sobering Stories with me, DJ Petrovsky. If this is your first time here, no, this isn't how I always dress. But I appreciate you giving me a shot, clicking on that thumbnail. Hopefully you enjoy everything from here. I would recommend that you just hit the subscribe button, don't ask questions, and we'll move forward. If you're a returning viewer, sup Sobers? Now I don't have many business items for the day, but I did want to talk about our sponsor for the week. Now, when I was first starting off my channel, I had never really gotten any messages from anybody. I'd never gotten reached out to by anybody. So, of course, when I started getting emails from people, I was extremely weary. I was like, I don't know if I should respond to this. I don't know if this is real. Who is this person? One of the first messages that I ever got was from a guy named Jeremy, and he is an artist named Hellraizer. And initially, he was just praising me on my most recent episode. I think it was the one about Aaron Carter. He might have watched another one, I can't remember exactly, but he did give me a link to his Quora article that he had written. And this article was phenomenal. It had a list of all these different celebrities or famous people who somehow mysteriously disappeared or passed away, and some of the circumstances surrounding what happened. Now, when I was first getting started, that was one of the hardest things for me, was trying to figure out which topics to cover. So his article was amazingly helpful for me to start getting a solid direction and a solid idea of where I wanted to go with the channel. Not only was Jeremy super helpful with the channel, but he was one of my earliest subscribers. He's been around for a hot minute, and he does his own thing as well. And you guys know that I am big on supporting the homies, so that's why this week's sponsor is going to be Hellraizer. Right before I sat down to film this, I was trying to think of how I could describe his music. I don't know, the closest thing I could think of was maybe like 9 Inch Nails-ish, but there's really nothing that sounds like Hellraizer. Nothing at all, in my opinion.
Beating my chest, getting erased, trying to test my patience, but I failed with this. Can't fake peace when the war's still aside. Try love once, but that part of me died. Fuck with the shadows, cold with the dead. Burn me deep where the silence is. Yeah, erase every trace, every sin, every dead. Begging for mercy, I'm dying to forgive.
It's extremely unique, and I truly dig the vibes. It's a darker vibe for sure, but the beats are amazing. He makes all the beats himself. Just truly a talented dude. I love it. And he's been sharing his music with me, but you can also find him on Spotify, on Apple Music, pretty much anywhere you can listen to music. And if you end up falling in love with his music, then he's got a members-only program on his website, just hellraizer.com, and you can get a backstage pass, which just gets you members exclusive stuff. But I would highly recommend you go support him, at least follow him on his Instagram, show him some love, and I don't know, it's just my way of saying thank you, because he truly has been a huge support to the channel and very instrumental in me getting started with this whole Sobering Stories journey. So Truly appreciate you, Jeremy. Thank you so much. And go check out Hellraizer, you guys. You won't be disappointed. Now, last week we talked about nauseating Nancy Spungen. If you haven't watched that episode, it's not necessarily imperative or required that you go back and watch it, but it is highly encouraged because it gives you a lot of context as to why she was called nauseating Nancy, as well as the fact that it may not entirely be her fault that she was such a difficult, abrasive, obnoxious person. So it gives you a little bit more empathy and understanding of who Nancy Spungen was. And where we left off with that episode was her actually meeting Sid Vicious from the Sex Pistols. So today, what I wanted to go through was Sid Vicious's story, Sid Vicious's story, and I want to really dig into what created the most iconic figure in punk rock. Now, I know it sounds like a real name, but Sid Vicious is not his real name. He was actually named John Simon Ritchie. He was born on May 10th, 1957 in Lewisham, London. His mom's name was Anne MacDonald, and she served a brief period in the British Army. While serving, she ended up meeting a Buckingham Palace guard named John Ritchie, and the two of them hit it off, ended up getting together, and now we have John Simon Ritchie. When Sid was 3 years old, him and his family were going to go to Ibiza for a family vacation. And John Ritchie had told Anne, like, yo, you and John Jr. should go over to Ibiza, start your vacation, start enjoying yourselves. I still have to finish up some stuff over here, but I will meet you guys up over there, and we will enjoy some vacation time together. After about a couple weeks, no word from John, no sign of him at all. He never showed up. Essentially, he just disappeared. I mean, you've got to give him some props, though, because it's not like he just went to the milk store and then never came home. He came up with some really creative ideas to get out of this whole situation. He's like, no, let's go on vacation together. You guys go over there, and then I'll meet you up. Nope. It's pretty wild. Kind of messed up, John. Of course, this leaves them stranded in Ibiza, and John had told them that he would send money during their trip so that they could, keep buying things and enjoy their time over there. And of course, he never sent them any money. With him now disappearing, she's left high and dry. She doesn't have a way to make money, she doesn't have money, and she's in this foreign place, no friends, no family, nothing. All it is her and John Simon Ritchie. Now, she calls him Cy or Sime most of the time as like a little nickname, and likely that is because she didn't want anything to do with John Ritchie anymore. So the best way to go about it, not have to hear his name all the time and think of him, would be to go by Simon, his middle name. I'm going to call him Sid because it's easier for me that way. Probably easier for you to follow along with, too, than hearing John and Simon and Ritchie and Jingleheimer Schmidt. Sid's mom says that he would start drinking at the age of 3. He would already go around and just drink friends and, people who were around. He would drink the last little bits of their brandies or, their beers. And then when he was 3 years old and they were at a restaurant, he was asking for a brandy from his mom. She kept saying, no, you're not going to have one. No, definitely not. But he was relentless. He's like, no, I want one. I want a brandy. Please get me a brandy. So eventually she's like, well, it's really gross. I highly doubt he's going to drink it as a 3-year-old. He's just going to make a weird face and spit it out. And so she's like, fine, I'll just order him a brandy. Okay, what? That makes sense, sure. But she orders him a brandy thinking he's going to take that sip, spit it out, and that'll be the end of it. But instead, he drinks the entire glass. Just like we talk about each and every single week. Those ages 0 to 5, very crucial. And in Sid's case, already drinking at 3 years old. Funny story, my dad told me that I would do very similar things when they lived in Germany. I would go and kind of sneakily at the table take all the empty beer bottles or all the empty beer steins, and I would just drink the last little bit that was in there. Yeah, I turned out to be an alcoholic, so very crucial time period, guys. Now, a lot of the information that I gathered for this episode came from this book called Sid's Way, which is an account from Anne MacDonald, mostly herself. And the thing that I found very interesting in this book is that there's no mention of her struggles with addiction literally at all. And one thing I know about Anne MacDonald is that she was a huge addict, but things started small for her. She tried to find ways to make money while they were stranded in Ibiza, and one of the easiest ways to do that is obviously selling things. So she started selling the devil's lettuce, and that held them over for a little while, but it certainly wasn't enough. And eventually she got burned out on trying to make things work in Ibiza. And so she decided to take Sid back home to London, and she moved back in with her mom. They stayed with Anne's mom for a little while, but then they moved out and got their own place in Soho in the Windmill District, which I guess, I don't know personally, but I guess it's really well known for sex work, addiction, substance use, just, I don't know, the other side of the law kind of things. During their time in Soho, this is when Anne's devil's lettuce addiction slowly starts turning into darker and darker addictions. This is when she starts dabbling with black tar. Things really start to go downhill for both her and Sid at this point. Now, Anne was still dealing, but I guess she also worked at this Ronnie Scott jazz club, and she had these connections because John Ritchie actually was a trombone player in the London jazz scene. So she knew some people within this jazz club and was able to work there part-time. Now, this is the same time period that Sid started going to school. He went to St. Peter and St. Paul in Soho, and he had this weird twitching problem when he was little, and I'm not really sure what that even means. I'm assuming it's just kind of like a weird twitch or like a weird movement that he does. But it attracted the attention of school bullies, in particular a kid named Lionel. Within the school, he was known as Lionel the Terrible, which is a great nickname to have for sure. After Anne says she brought this whole bullying situation to the attention of the school, they basically told her, we've already been dealing with Lionel the Terrible, and there's not a whole lot we can do. He's already in therapy, he's already getting help, but nothing seems to be working. So I guess sorry. Obviously, this made Anne really mad that they weren't going to do anything for her kid, so she wrote them a really nasty letter and told them that they would be leaving the school, and that's what they did. They packed up, and she sent Sid to go to a different school called the Farm Street School. This was in Grosvenor Square, and it was near the American Embassy. But he was forced to wear like a little school uniform, you know, with like the little blazer and the tie and everything. And honestly, Sid was a fairly good student, but he didn't really like many subjects. He liked art, he liked history, he loved to paint, and he loved music. In fact, on Sid's report card, he got really good grades, but the teachers just mentioned that he really struggled with concentration. And back then, nobody knew anything about ADHD, so that's probably what it was. He was just like me and had no attention for anything and was hyperactive in class. Probably a disruption. And they probably didn't know how to deal with that back then. In February of 1965, they packed up again and moved to Oxford. And this is where Anne would meet Chris Beverly. Anne and Chris would get married almost immediately. And Sid would take on the Beverly last name for a short period of time, but he never officially got adopted by Chris. And unfortunately, in August of 1965, just 6 months after they got married, Chris would die unexpectedly from some random kidney infection, just leaving the family high and dry again. One of the only real benefits that came out of this marriage was after Chris's passing, one of his old nannies from when he was younger had a private school that she ran out of the St. Peter's Church in Tunbridge Wells. And Sid actually got to go attend this school, live at the church from the age of 9 all the way up until he was 11. Now, this was great for Sid because he apparently thrived at this school. He probably appreciated the structure. He probably appreciated having adults there who were taking care of him, showing him attention. And unfortunately, at the same time, his mom, Anne, was slowly slipping deeper into her addiction issues. She was now pretty much a full-blown black tar user. She was probably really stoked to have him gone for a couple of years. She could basically just do whatever she wants to do and continue to support her habits. Yet again, I find it very strange that the book Sid's Way mentions nothing about this. It barely even mentions the fact that Sid was living at the school, for this long especially. Unfortunately, this would complete Sid's primary education and he would move on to secondary school, in which case he went to the Sandown School. But I guess Sid's mom had a real problem with the fact that they would not allow kids to stay up so they could watch the moon landing, because if they weren't at school the next day, then they were going to get like an inexcused absence or reprimanded in some way. So she let him stay up anyways because she thought that it was really important for him to see the moon landing. And I mean, if this is true, then good for her, because why wouldn't you want your kid to see that? Why wouldn't the school want their kids to see that? It's a piece of history. It's monumental. So because of this, She let him stay up, watch the moon landing, and the next day she wrote a letter saying, "We are not coming back." So yet again, Sid transfers another school, and he moves over to a different secondary school in the area. Eventually, by the age of 15, Sid would get bored of school and he would just drop out. And his mom was so strung out at this point that she didn't even really notice that he had dropped out. She really didn't even know what was going on in Sid's life pretty much at all. Likely because Sid had moved around so much and gone to so many different schools and was never there long enough to really build up a good friend base or make any real friends. He became very isolated, he was very shy, he was very timid, and pretty much everybody remembers him from this time period being just like that. One thing that he was really into, though, was David Bowie. He was fascinated with David Bowie, the glam rock scene, the whole Ziggy Stardust, Aladdin Sane thing, and he would rock the mullet just like David Bowie. He would dress up in glam all the time just like Bowie, and he just absolutely was infatuated with David Bowie, which him and I can relate on that because I also have a love for David Bowie, especially the Ziggy Stardust phase, but yeah, we definitely mesh on that. Sid was also really into art and photography. And I don't know how many people actually know this about Sid Vicious, but his artwork is really good. He was a phenomenal artist. And had he pursued that as opposed to this whole Sex Pistols thing, he might have been a really talented artist. And he might have actually had more of a future that direction. But I guess we'll never know. In order to pursue this passion, though he dropped out of high school, he then enrolled in some college classes for photography at Hackney College. By this point, things had gotten so bad with Sid's mom that she honestly had no idea he was even attending college or doing these classes. And then at the age of 16, she decided to just kick him out of the house.
He left home for a while when he was 15.
Yeah.
And he stayed in somebody's flat in Bethnal Green somewhere. But after a couple of months I said, "Oh, come on, son, come back home." It was a row. I can remember saying to him, "Sign, it's either you or me, and it's not going to be me.
Right.
I have got to try and preserve myself, you know what I mean? And you just off." And he said, "Well, I've got nowhere to go." And I said, "I don't care, you sleep on a park bloody bench, just fat your bags and go."
While he was attending college classes, he actually met 3 other dudes named John, because remember, Sid's real name is John Simon Ritchie. So these 4 Johns, John Gray, John Wardle, John Lydon, and John Ritchie, all start hanging out. Really what they start doing is just bumming around, squatting at all these different locations around town, and getting more and more immersed into the music scene there. They all start hanging around that shop Sex that we were talking about. They start getting more and more immersed into the punk scene. And then, like we talked about before, Johnny Rotten gets picked up to be one of the Sex Pistols. Now, Sid and him were already like best friends, but now he was in this amazing rock band. So, of course, Sid is their #1 fan. Now, Sid starts mobbing around with this whole group of groupies that follow the Sex Pistols called Bromley's Contingent, and he becomes this fixture in the group. Now, all 4 of these guys are named John, so what? We can't call each other John? It's confusing. So, of course, they had to come up with nicknames. We've already got Johnny Rotten. John Wardle ends up becoming Jaw Wobble. John Ritchie, because he was hanging out with Johnny Rotten one day, and Johnny Rotten has a hamster that was named Sid, after Sid Barrett from Pink Floyd, which is kind of funny because he had that I Hate Pink Floyd shirt. This hamster, his name was Sid. One day, John Ritchie, aka Sid Vicious, went up to the hamster and was like sticking his hand in there to play with him, and Sid tried to bite his finger. He was like, "Whoa, Sid's pretty vicious. Yo, Sid Vicious, that's going to be your name. That's a great nickname."
Actually, don't go on, because the name does come from Sid Barrett of Pink Floyd. Well, we called him Vicious because he wasn't vicious. He's just a big baby who eats sweets.
I thought you called him Sid because that was an albino hamster.
Yeah, that was why I was called Sid. So he started calling me Sid to all my friends and saying, "Look, this is Sid." I was Sid forever after, so I'm stuck with it now, so I might as well like it.
And do you?
Yeah.
And this is a defining moment for Sid, because he would spend the rest of his life trying to live up to that name.
Vicious is a good word to describe me. I'm not good at fighting, but if I get somebody on the ground, then they are finished. You know what I mean? If I beat somebody, I beat them bad.
Suddenly, this quiet, introverted, shy young man had a whole new personality, a whole new persona, and I think he had a lot of angst and a lot of frustration that had built up from a lifetime of being neglected by his mom and from not being accepted, not really having a place he could call his home. And once he finally did find a place like that where he was thriving, he was in and out so quickly that he wasn't even able to enjoy himself or fully blossom in any space in his life. Because of Sid's mom's addictions, obviously Sid was introduced to the same things very early on, not only drinking at the age of 3, but she also introduced him to drugs.
By the time Simon was in school, she was on speed and other pharmaceuticals and was just, really going downhill.
Sid said one of his main memories of his childhood was his mother pushing him away so she could shoot up. And he would try to laugh it off, just say, oh, no wonder I'm a fucking junkie then. But, it was one of those things you could sense, that there was a real kind of rage beneath it.
Jaw Wobble recounts a time when Sid and his mom were both shooting up together. And I guess Sid was using speed, his mom was using black tar. And Sid wasn't really using black tar at this point, but he was definitely doing a lot of other things, speed being the main thing he was doing. Sid was so hyped about the Sex Pistols, it got him amped about wanting to start his own band. So he was working really hard to try and either get involved with a band or start his own thing. At one point, a band called The Damned, they were very interested in having Sid come out and audition to be a lead singer. Unfortunately, Sid didn't even show up for the audition. So it's kind of strange that he was super pissed off and showed up at one of their shows and threw a glass bottle at their new lead singer that was chosen instead of him because he didn't show up for the audition. He missed that lead singer. The bottle smashed against a pillar, and some of the shards of glass smashed into this girl's eye, blinding her permanently. Sid was arrested. Nothing came of this. He wasn't charged with anything because that poor girl is now blinded for life because of Sid's drunken reactions. It just shows how crazy Sid is starting to become, and it's almost like he's trying to live up to this vicious name. Now, Sid didn't really have any musical abilities, so it's kind of strange he wanted to be in a band. At this same time, punk rock was not really about the talent or the music itself. It was about the fashion, it was about the community, the scene, it was about the statements. It was about so much more than just the music. So for him to want to get into it totally makes sense.
Another new friend he made at that time was a girl called Vivienne, who went on to become the guitarist in the all-girl group, The Slits.
The first time I met Sid was outside a pub in Ladbroke Grove, and he was standing next to John Rotten, and Sid was like tall and skinny with black spiky hair, and John tall and skinny with blonde spiky hair, and they looked like a couple of bookends, and Sid, who was called John as well then, was kind of a bit sheepish and kind of sweet really, and someone suggested something about I needed to be in a band and he needed a band, and he said, oh, I'll play with you, and I was really sort of touched and quite flattered really, because he looked really cool and he had a sort of nice air about him, and he was with John, who of course I already knew, and so I thought, yeah, and that's it. But that's how we decided we'd meet up in Joe Strummer's squat about a week later and see what we could do. The group that me and Sid were in first was called the Flowers of Romance, and that was named by John Rotten, which kind of went against all the names at the time, like Penetration or all the heavy sort of sexual and aggressive names. He thought it was quite funny to come out with something quite opposite to that, which was really good. Sid played saxophone. I don't know even where he got the saxophone from, but he would just sort of toot on it and jump up and down, because he invented that pogo thing, and he was doing that right back then before anyone went to gigs or anything. He'd jump up and down with his knees and feet together. Yeah. And Palmolive was on drums, and I'd play guitar, and I could barely play. Palmolive could barely play. Sid couldn't play, but it was good. I wrote the songs So Tough for the Flowers of Romance, and that was after months of us being together. I mean, I couldn't write a song, I couldn't play, and that was the first one I wrote, and it was good, still a good song, and it was about Sid, and it came out of a conversation with me and John Rotten over the phone. And then just as I wrote that, he decided, he wanted a really good guitarist or something naff like that, and got someone like Marco in. It didn't last, of course, because there's no chemistry there or anything, but So Tough went on to be a good song on the Slits album.
And then he also played a guest appearance where he played drums, where he just basically banged on the drums because he has no idea what he's doing, for a band called Susie and the Banshees. Flowers of Romance They would never play live, and they would never record anything. But Keith Levine, which was one of the members, would go on to start the band The Clash, which I'm sure most of you guys know. Unfortunately for Sid, he would never really take the time to sit down and learn how to play an instrument. He was spending all of his time just acting out, being as crazy as possible, trying to live up to that vicious name.
I can remember at that time that Sid started to display a slightly boorish kind of aspect to his personality. It was as if he was taking the darker kind of more nihilistic elements of punk too seriously. And I particularly remember a story of him having killed a cat, which I thought seemed really kind of deeply sad even then.
There was a cat that was in the flat, and for no reason he decided to put a noose around the cat and hang it up in front of me. And it didn't last long as far as ticks on the clock, but it seemed like an eternity. And the cat was struggling and trying to get away, but obviously it couldn't. It was whining. It was absolutely fighting to get away. And just before it passed away, it urinated and defecated right on his feet. And Sid was holding it in front of me. I utterly regret not stopping him doing that. Why he did that, I don't know. I have no idea. It's the most disgusting thing that I've ever seen in my life, and if I could have my life all over again, that is the biggest regret, that I would stop him from doing that. It was horrible. And then finally put the cat in a plastic bag and took it to the bin downstairs. It was horrible.
He was starting to build a name for himself, not as a famous rock star or musician, but as just this legendary punk rock figure. People recognized him, people loved his style, and the more time he spent at the sex shop, the more he got immersed into the fashion side of the punk world. It's almost like the planets had to align perfectly for Sid to have ended up in the position that he was. He suddenly became this icon because of how he dressed, but also what he did, and just the things that were going on all at the same time with the punk movement. It's just like he was at the right place at the right time, and he continued to feed into what he realized people were liking about him. And he'd spent so much of his life feeling isolated, alone, and not ever having a group of people to call, his friends or like people that he identified with. So he finally had a group of people that not only recognized him, but also appreciated him and were simply in awe of this guy. He's insane, but he just emulates everything that punk music stands for, which is why when they kicked Glenn Matlock out of the band, Sid Vicious was a no-brainer. They knew that they had to bring him on, not because he was an amazing bass player, but because he already could draw a crowd, not even being on the stage. He had the look, he had the attitude, and he honestly was the perfect fourth member of the band. Malcolm McLaren would go on to say that Johnny Rotten was the voice of punk, but Sid Vicious was the attitude, the image, the avatar for punk music. In March of 1977, Sid would play his very first Sex Pistols show, and they kept him completely unplugged from the amp because, well, obvious reasons. He couldn't play. So not only is Sid being rewarded for not even knowing how to play bass, and now he's in a band, but he's also being rewarded for acting literally as crazy as possible, starting as much trouble and chaos as he possibly can, acting as insane as possible on stage and off stage, really living up to that vicious name. And of course, what goes along with chaos better than substances? Nothing, really. Of course, Sid starts diving deeper and deeper into his addictions. He's drinking all of the time. He's shooting up speed. He's starting to dabble in black tar. he's starting to dabble in pills or whatever's around. He really doesn't even care. In fact, there was a story that he was offered some pills once, and he ate a bunch of them, and then after that asked what they were. He just was on that level where he didn't really care. He was willing to do anything, and he thrived off of people seeing him as this absolutely crazy, unpredictable character. Shortly after his first gig with the Sex Pistols, in that same month of March in 1977, this is when he would meet Nancy Spungen hanging out at that party, and she initially had her sights set on Johnny Rotten. Then she kind of made her way through the rest of the band and the other guys that were around before Sid finally felt bad for her and gave her a chance. But from the moment that those two laid eyes on each other and linked up, they were inseparable from that point on. Then in April of 1977, while playing a gig in Amsterdam, Sid actually attacks a journalist because of some of the negative things that he wrote about the Sex Pistols, just further highlighting this bad boy outlaw image. Then June of 1977, that's when the Sex Pistols released probably one of their biggest hits, called God Save the Queen. And this song is explosively huge because that is like the last thing that you do is disrespect the royal family, and they did it. Mainstream status. So of course the song gets banned pretty much everywhere, and the Sex Pistols themselves get banned from playing pretty much anywhere, literally anywhere in London, anywhere in England. They are banned from playing. They're banned on the radios. They're trying to silence these guys. Now, despite the band being banned from playing pretty much anywhere, and from their song being played on the radio, God Save the Queen still hits number 2 on the charts. And in order to get around this whole ban on them playing gigs, they end up doing this secret boat show, and it's this huge party on this boat. But unfortunately, when they get back to the docks, the cops are waiting for them.
Brothers and Old Laurie, which this is part of.
Just adding more and more to this hype around not only punk music, but the Sex Pistols. They are just this absolute iconic band that was the face of the punk rock scene. Then in October of 1977, the Sex Pistols would release their one and only studio album called Nevermind the Bollocks, Here's the Sex Pistols. Despite all the bans and despite all of the suppression, the album still does amazingly well. Getting banned in the UK was probably the best thing for that image. They were trying to erupt chaos, they were trying to make a statement, and getting banned from playing shows, though it probably had a negative impact on their ability to play, definitely helped their image. But they found a way around this because they just dropped a new album. And of course, everybody wants to see them. Everybody wants to know, who is this band that's getting banned? We've got to know. So in order to weasel their way around these bans, they would deal with promoters directly, and they would book these shows under these weird pseudonames. So they would change the name of the band every show they played, and it inevitably became what's known as the S.P.O.T.S Tour. S.P.O.T.S is an acronym that stands for Sex Pistols on Tour Secretly. S.P.O.T.S was also one of the names they used. They also used Tax Exiles, Special Guest, Acne Rabble, The Hamsters, and Mystery Band of International Repute. Now, during this tour, Nancy had been with Sid the entire time. The two of them were inseparable, but nauseating Nancy was driving everybody crazy. In fact, Johnny Rotten and Malcolm McLaren and tons of the band members talked about coming up with a plan to basically kidnap her, stick her on a plane back to the United States, and get rid of her for good. Because she was really having a negative impact on Sid. She was getting him way further into the whole drug scene. The two of them had become really, really serious addicts with the black tar.
Everyone knows when a bird starts poking their nose into a rock and roll band that it's suicidal. because that's when he really started getting fucked up and not caring about playing. I didn't want anything to do with her.
We did everything to get rid of Nancy that was physically possible. I even dangled her out of a window one night by her ankles.
The rest of the band hated me because I was just New York Dolls, Johnny and Jerry, and they were junkies.
And of course, you can only do so much black tar before you become completely useless, and your only goal in life is to then figure out how to not feel sick every day. So this is exactly what started happening with Sid and Nancy. And not only were they codependent with each other because of their addictions, but Nancy has always been a person that likes to control her surroundings. It was her goal to marry a rock star, to get herself a rock star that she could mold and basically take her to wherever she wanted to go. And Sid has always been needing someone to nurture him. He's always been isolated and alone. He's always craved that motherly attention that he just never got because his mom was a drug addict. So finally, the two of them were both getting what they needed from the other person. It was the perfect recipe of a horribly toxic concoction. Many people liken Nancy to Yoko Ono and John Lennon because of the way that Nancy kind of just stole Sid away from the band, and slowly his focus began to shift from the Sex Pistols and continuing to be this icon and the band and where their trajectory was going, slowly over to Nancy and their drug use and finding their next fix. Pretty much just a complete 180 from where he was prior. But the band was still extremely successful at this point, and they were actually offered to come to the US for a US tour, which is huge. I mean, that is massive. They're going to go over to the United States, internationally touring. This band has made it, but they know they're not going to make it very much longer if Sid keeps doing what he's doing and keeps hanging out with Nancy. So they basically give him an ultimatum. You cannot bring Nancy, no girlfriends on the tour, and you have to stop doing the black tar. You just can't do it. We won't have it. We're not going to allow you. We're not going to get it for you. And we're certainly not going to help you find it. So Sid agrees, and in January of 1978, the band heads to America to begin their US tour. And the funny thing about this tour is that Malcolm McLaren books them for some of the most conservative areas in the US, knowing damn well that these areas are not going to receive the Sex Pistols very well at all. But this is all planned. He's hoping that it's going to start more chaos, it's going to start more fights, it's going to have possibly some negative media attention, which is only going to boost up the image of the Sex Pistols. Honestly, it's kind of genius. They traveled to Atlanta, Memphis, Baton Rouge, Dallas, Tulsa, and then finally they played in San Francisco on January 14th. The tour was a complete disaster. Nothing seemed to be going right. Sid was completely off the rails because he wasn't doing the black tar at this point. So he was doing literally any sort of substance he could find. He was drinking completely out of control, and understandably so, because, I mean, you can't just quit cold turkey like that. Like, that's just, it's not an easy way to go. You probably have these intense withdrawals, and he probably was finding any substance that he could to try and make himself feel better. But it got so bad that during one of the shows, he actually carved into his chest with a knife the words, "Gimme a fix," and he was hoping that somebody in the audience would see his message and hook him up. And they did. At the end of the show in San Francisco, Johnny Rotten just seems like he's over it. At the very end, he makes a statement, and you can just tell he's done.
Ever get the feeling you've been cheated? Good night.
And sure enough, the Sex Pistols disbanded, and that would be the last show that we'd ever see from the Sex Pistols, at least the original Sex Pistols. Once the Sex Pistols disbanded, Sid spiraled hard. He hung out in Haight-Ashbury for a few days. He crashed a local punk show that was going on, rolling around on stage. He was bleeding all over the place because he had cut himself. Just a mess. He was trying to get off of the black tar. He was going to a methadone clinic, getting a fix there, but he was continuing to use all kinds of other drugs. He was drinking, just not looking good for Sid. After 5 days of lingering in San Francisco, Sid got ready to head to New York. Unfortunately, he had taken too much methadone, Valium, and was drinking so much that on the plane ride he slipped into a coma, and when the plane finally landed, they had to rush him to the Jamaica hospital that was near JFK.
The night the group split up, Vicious was pulled off a plane at Kennedy Airport, the victim of a drug overdose. Since then, he's lived at the Chelsea Hotel, performing infrequently.
They brought him back. He ended up being okay, but the doctors told him, like, if you keep drinking, you're going to be dead in 6 months. And this seemed to be a really dark realization for Sid. He must have realized that he'll never get out of this hole that he's in. And he was so down that he had this really heartfelt conversation with a photographer he'd made friends with during that tour. It's kind of a really sad conversation because he essentially says, like, I'm not going to live very much longer.
Hello, Sid? Hello? Sid?
Yeah.
Hi, this is Roberta. You remember me from the tour?
Yeah.
The photographer, the one whose thumb you kicked in.
Huh?
The one whose thumb you broke.
I broke your thumb.
Well, nearly. You just broke the nail. How are you? You all
How did I
right?
do that?
What? When? Or why?
Oh, yeah, I remember.
In
You come over and visit me in hospital.
Yeah, I would do, but it's snowing.
Oh.
I don't have a car, and you can't go on the trains because the wind's too high. Come in the city. I mean, all kinds of people want to see you and everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, you've never been here before. You could have a good time. If you're healthy enough to do it.
Yeah, I don't know if I can't drink. I can't, like, the doctor said that if I, like, drunk, anything even, like, vaguely remotely, like the way I've been drinking for the past, like, however long, that I've got about 6 months at the absolute outside to live.
Oh, come on, well then don't drink. You asshole.
And, like, the drugs as well, like, more or less I can't do anything. So, like, if I went out anywhere, I'd have to just, like, sit there. If I went out anywhere, I wouldn't be able to resist the temptation. That'd be the trouble.
You have to straighten up for a while.
I can't straight. I just can't be straight. Because I haven't been straight in, like, 4 years. When I got out of hospital, I just, like, really fucked myself up as badly as I could. I don't know why, but everybody said you can't do it, so, like, I just went ahead and done it.
I know somebody like that did the same thing.
That's my basic nature.
Yeah, but your basic nature is going to get you in a lot of trouble.
My basic nature is going to kill me in 6 months.
Once Sid gets released from the hospital, him and Nancy meet up in New York, and they decide, since they have no money because Malcolm cut Sid off from any funds from the Sex Pistols, and of course Nancy doesn't have any money because she's just as broke as Sid is, they decide that they're going to figure things out. Nancy's going to be his manager. They're going to start a solo career for Sid, and they're going to make it big in the US. And it's at this point that Nancy and Sid decide to move into the Chelsea Hotel. With Nancy as Sid's manager, they actually did more than I thought they would. Sid came out with an album of a bunch of different covers that he sang, and one of those covers was the song My Way, which was famously performed by Frank Sinatra. Now, here's a little fun fact about the song My Way, because I know you guys love fun facts. But the song My Way was originally written as a French pop song, but music producer David Pitt wanted David Bowie to rewrite the song to make it, more appealing to English audiences. So David Bowie rewrote the song, but they didn't like the name that he gave it, and so they decided to have somebody else rewrite it. And this guy's name was Paul Anka, and he ended up rewriting it, and the English version was hugely popular, much like the original French version. And then, of course, Frank Sinatra would find the song and perform it as well, really popularizing the song. And Sid slays it, let me tell you. This song actually becomes extremely popular, and it's one of those songs that was hugely sought after. Everybody wanted to get this song. To this day, Sid's version of My Way is one of the most popular renditions of that song. Now, Sid reluctantly performed this song for a film that they were making called The Great Rock and Roll Swindle, and this film was essentially about how Malcolm McLaren used these guys to embezzle money from them and boost up his own fashion business, which is essentially exactly what happened. But it's interesting that they're making this film and they're including Sid Vicious in it, and in order for Sid to get out of his management from Malcolm McLaren and have Nancy become his manager, he does this song with the agreement that once he does it, he will no longer be managed by Malcolm. And like I said, that song was huge. It made tons of money, and he actually got a pretty decent payout for that. And I'm sure you're wondering, like, why doesn't Sid have tons of money? Weren't the Sex Pistols, like, really popular, really successful, all that? Well, yes, they were, but Malcolm McLaren literally gave all of the guys some sort of allotted spending allowance that they were allowed to have to eat, buy drugs, live, whatever. It's definitely a little bit suspicious, and you can only imagine that he was likely stealing from them, claiming some of those earnings for essentially being their manager and starting this band and all these things. So Malcolm McLaren was certainly taking advantage of these guys, and that is one of the main reasons that Johnny Rotten decided to leave the band. He was having issues with Sid. The band really didn't stand for much anymore. It was just all about chaos, and he was starting to lose sight of what they were doing. And then on top of everything else, Malcolm was stealing from these guys. So he just didn't want a part of it anymore. And honestly, neither would I. Despite Sid having somewhat of a solo career, him and Nancy were literally living day by day, living broke, essentially doing nothing, staying inside nearly all day, every day, basically just getting high at the Chelsea Hotel. There's some reports saying that they tried to sober up. They were working on going down to the methadone clinic and trying to get off the black tar. But ultimately, they just ended up being on methadone and black tar and drinking, smoking, taking tons of different pills. They just spiraled hard. But because they were in the United States, and Nancy's not very far away from home, her family lives in Pennsylvania, she's like, Sid, let's go see my family. I want you to meet my mom. I want you to meet my family. So they hop on a train. They make the train ride out. Deb actually picks them up from the train station, and she remembers seeing them, and she remembers this really harrowing experience seeing both of them come off the train. She talks about how they both looked like they were this really pale, almost translucent color. They looked extremely sick. Everybody in the train station was like looking at them and noticing them, but they were acting like nothing was wrong, like nothing was happening. They were totally normal. And Deb just recalls how sad she was to see her daughter in that state. And she recalls how just kind of like scared and shy Sid was. He kind of lurked behind Nancy and didn't really say a whole lot. I don't know. She just did not get good vibes from him, and she felt extremely worried for their health.
My husband and I went to the Trenton Railroad Station, and you have to picture a hot summer Friday afternoon. All the commuters are coming back from New York, and the station is crowded, and people are pushing to get on their way. And we were rather nervous. I know I had a knot in my stomach, and I wondered if I would know Nancy. And suddenly I heard this scream, and it was, Mum! Nancy seems always to have picked up her English accent or whatever accent, depending on who she was with. And I looked, and there was a face. It was, to me, it was like chiaroscuro, black and white. They just stood out from everybody on the platform. And Nancy's hair was pure white. It was blonde, but to white, and her skin was that white color that you see in perhaps people that are about to die, that kind of translucent pallor, and there were small bruises, and she was dressed in clothing that I was totally unfamiliar with, and Sid was kind of hiding, almost lurking shyly behind her, and he looked very similar, except his hair was darker, but this pallor about them, and everyone in the train station on the platform had just stopped, and they were gaping at them, and Sid and Nancy seemed to have no knowledge that anyone was looking at them or that they looked any differently than anybody else on the platform. And Nancy ran over and she hugged me. That was one of the few times she put her arms around me. She goes, my mom, my beautiful mom, I'm here. And she introduced me to Sid, and he kind of hung his head, and then he shook my hand, and he shook my husband's hand. But it was a very emotional, traumatic moment, because this was not the Nancy that I even knew a year and a half ago. I just kept thinking to myself, where's my baby? You know, I want her back. Who is this stranger?
Obviously, by this point, Deb realizes that Nancy's in really deep with her addiction, and so is Sid. So they do their best to just make him comfortable and take care of him and let him know they're there for him. Just seems fairly normal while they're out there, but unfortunately they're still just wasting their time, laying around all day, just getting high. Deb recalls Sid being very quiet, not really saying a whole lot. He wasn't very interactive, and he also didn't really care if everybody else wanted to do one thing, but he wanted to do something else. He was just very complacent. He was very quiet, and he wouldn't talk to Nancy's family members directly. He would always talk to Nancy and have them relay to the family members whatever it is he was trying to say. The other thing they found very weird was when they were eating dinner, they all had steaks, and Nancy came over and cut Sid's steak for him.
She used to cut his meat for him at the dinner table. What do you think?
I think that they had people have asked me, did they love each other? And I can only say what I observed, and I guess it's not the kind of love perhaps that you and I know, but there was kind of almost a symbiotic relationship. She took care of him. She was, in a way, his mother. Nancy was, by all reports, and we certainly know that, extremely bright. And Sid had not had that much education, and he had a special sensitivity, I guess, but he needed to be taken care of. And so she took care of him, but sometimes she needed to be taken care of, and it appears that in those areas he took care of her.
And they acted like it was totally normal, not out of the ordinary. That to me just shows how motherly Nancy was to Sid and how much he enjoyed and needed that nurturing mother-like energy and presence in his life. After spending a little time during the summer of 1978 with Nancy's family, Nancy and Sid decide they're going to head back to New York and continue working on Sid's solo career. But once they get back to New York, that's when tragedy strikes at the Chelsea Hotel. So we'll leave it there, and we will check back in with you guys for part 3 next week when we do another one. But if you can't get enough sobering stories, you just want more, you're like, bro, what the H? I want to know. I understand that, and I'm sorry. But there is other stories you can listen to. I've got a Sobering Stories playlist I'll leave at the end. You can watch every single one of them. I will leave probably one of my Kurt Cobain videos down there because that's a really good series you should check out. And then I will also leave probably, I don't know, maybe the Did He Do It playlist? I don't know. You'll see in a second. But anyways, hopefully you guys enjoyed this Sid story, learning a little bit more about Sid Vicious, a.k.a. John Simon Ritchie, and where he came from and what led to him going down the spiral that he did. I look forward to next week because next week we're going to talk about what happened to Nancy and then ultimately what happened to Sid very shortly after that. So buckle up for that part because yet again, the story just keeps getting crazier. But I appreciate you guys sitting and hanging out with me for this long. I hope you enjoy the rest of your weekend. Hope you have an amazing week. I hope you sleep safe. I hope you stay sober. And God save the Queen. Later, Sobers.
Save a queen. A fascist regime.
Let's go.